I have the honor of still serving on Sydney's doctoral committee, and initially mentoring and then learning from Sydney has been the true joy and one of the singular highlights of my own academic career. Her research on farmers' attempts to get a life of their own and redefine their family's place in the world is just tremendously innovative. We'll hear about today, and it's been recognized by grants by leading institutions like the Wenner Gren Foundation. In my circles of rural research, social scientific research, it is literally like amongst the most highly anticipated projects to emerge. And I think we're all very privileged to get to hear about it in its burgeoning form today. So please join me in welcoming Sydney.
Thank you, Alex. Is my audio okay? Wonderful. Well, my name is Sydney Giacalone, and I'm a doctoral candidate in anthropology at Brown. I am so honored and excited to be back at Tufts with you all today. As you see, the title of my talk is A Rural Agrarian Reckoning, Multigenerational Farmers Seeking to Repair Soil, Agriculture, and Rural America Itself. So our agenda for today, I'm going to start off with how I came to this work from my time at Tufts. I'll then go into some context and research questions of my dissertation, which I'm in the 5th of 6 years. I'm then going to focus in on the theme of reckoning within and against through 3 stories, which I'll explain what I mean by that more in a bit. And then we'll end with questions and discussions. So I came to Tufts in 2013 knowing that I wanted to study food systems through environmental studies. That was the first year that the food systems track was offered, and I signed up for a few courses. It happened that all of the food-related courses I signed up for were in anthropology, and I quickly found that I think about food systems as an anthropologist. Alex, as well as Kathy Stanton, were and continue to be the reason that I found my home in this discipline. With their mentorship, I conducted research on urban chicken keeping in Somerville, this chicken of many, and the technopolitics of food desert mapping in Baltimore. After graduating in 2017, I had a bit of an unconventional first year out of undergrad. Alongside Julian Agerman and UEP, we co-edited a book on the intersection of immigration and ag in the US, particularly responding to the political climate at the time, which now feels like a deja vu. I was also tutoring high schoolers at this time to make ends meet with skills that I have the Tufts Writing Fellows program to thank for. And after that, I worked for a few years at the Boston Foundation as a nonprofit consultant with grants management as well as college access scholarships. At this point, I knew I wanted to return to the space of academic inquiry around food and ag as both an environmental and social topic that I'd found through Tufts Environmental Studies and Anthro. And I began my PhD at Brown in the fall of 2020. So now we'll jump into my research, starting with a story. Casey, a 5th-generation farmer in rural Georgia, is proud of her dad's success regenerating degraded cropland. The story has made national headlines and attracted farmers, scientists, and researchers like me to witness how a former industrial family farm has turned around the health of their land and animals. Breaking from how you were raised isn't as simple as it looks, though. I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard for people to change, Casey reflects. It's not even just black and white, better or worse. It's disappointment from your ancestors. It's taking the gift of generational learning and throwing it away and starting something new. I think there's a lot that goes into that that's beyond some soil tests and economic studies and visible things that happen. Across the American Midwest and South, I study what I'm calling reckoning family farmers, rural multi-generational agrarians engaged in the social, political, and ecological work of learning about and then attempting to attend to the roles in their communities. These stories often start with a farmer's motivation to, quote, get out of industrial ag in response to the ecological impacts of their previous generations. As they begin to alter their practices, some are finding themselves naming the ag system they want to break from as not only a model of industrial monocultural production of the past few decades, but also a system of species-based, classed, colonial, racialized, and gendered hierarchies foundational to American ag since its start. So from within the family farm, the very unit of social and economic reproduction of this larger structure, how are they responding? Another way to put this is my research asks, as farmers attempt to disrupt the hierarchies upholding and constituting the American farm, how are family, ecological, and community relationships being broken, remade, or formed anew? Within that, what does explicitly reckoning with anthropocentrism, patriarchy, whiteness, our list could go on, within American ag actually entail? And what forms of repair and realliance might arise from attempts to counter these within the family farm itself? After 2 summers of pre-dissertation research in 2021 and 2022, I began 16 months of fieldwork last fall in 2023, and I have 1 more month living in Iowa before I'm supposed to get out of there and start writing a book. I've lived primarily in Georgia and Iowa, though you see that my methods have taken me all across the country, tracing where these farmers seek information and meet each other to form these networks. Approximately 50 family farms are participating in this research, as well as several dozen organizations that they are a part of and networking through. 13 families are ones that I'm especially focusing in, and we'll talk about several today that I've spent substantial time with. I've interviewed and spent time with multiple generations in each of these families, and several have been involved in the project for 4 years now. And all participants have been given pseudonyms in this presentation. A key part of my approach that I won't go too deep into today, but we could talk about in the questions, is that humans aren't the only ones I'm observing. Plants, animals, and microscopic lights are agents of change and experts in these stories too. I'd now like to show you a short video of myself and several farm employees moving about 1,000 mama cows and their babies from one field to another on a regenerative ranch in Georgia, just so you can get a snippet of what my fieldwork looks and especially sounds like. Okay. So, if you noticed, all the cows were waiting for us on that fence, just ready to go. That is because they know the main farm manager for the cows that I was working with. They know where to go on each day that they will be moving to the next area that they moved to about a month before. And I hope you also heard not only the cows communicating, but him communicating through his call. That is a call that he learned from his great-grandfather in this. And he also is a participant himself because he runs this farm, this cow program, but he also is a farmer himself otherwise. So on a practical ag level, these transitions I'm studying vary substantially. Some, like the one you just saw, have shifted from commercial cattle operations, which are often called conventional. And when I use that term, it usually means some version of high energy inputs, grain-fed, antibiotics, and fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides used on the pastures. They've shifted from that to regenerative cattle operations. Again, we can discuss the terms and the definitions, but usually defined as reduced to no chemical inputs for the land, rotational grazing of either cows or other species that use high impact and long recovery time to regenerate the soil's microbiome and fungal ratio, encourage plant diversity, increase water infiltration, increase soil organic matter, and eventually sequester carbon. This polywire fence is a key sign that someone's doing this, and the folks I work with actually use seeing this type of fencing as a way to know which farmers to ask advice on their own transitions. That's the person they go to and say, hey, I saw you're using this. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Others have transitioned from conventional corn and soy to regenerative row cropping, and that usually means eliminating or reducing tillage, reducing or eliminating chemical inputs, using multi-species cover crops or adding additional crop varieties, and at the highest level, integrating livestock grazing within the cropland. Still, others I'm working with have completely changed what they're producing, such as going from row crops to sheep, hogs, cattle to vegetables and goats, hogs to mushrooms and nut trees. Some are using the terms sustainable, organic, regenerative, holistic. Others respond to our terminology debate by saying, oh my gosh, y'all got too much time on your hands. Holding this in mind, I care less about the term and more about what people are actually doing. More broadly, though, the farmers transitioning toward environmental and socially reparative practices in this research are doing many things beyond ag. They're seeking out resources to learn or relearn about their land's history. They're re-educating themselves to think collaboratively with other species to improve animal, soil, and human health. They're becoming involved in local organizations' work on environmental repair, labor, racial equity, land access. Sometimes they're making difficult breaks from families or institutions. They're seeking out networks of others asking the same type of questions. These activities are often contentious within their rural conservative communities and are intertwined with the debates around politics, environmentalism, nationalism, and belonging. So, within each of these experiences, I'm studying the methods of reflection and reparation attempted by those questioning a system while living within it, particularly those who have helped create and have resources within that system. I'm going to use the rest of my talk today to dig deeper into this concept of being within and against while working towards change in rural space. Part 1, alliances across the fence. Alex and I are cleaning up and chatting in her kitchen. She's the 4th generation rancher in Washington State, now the 2nd generation to manage regeneratively after her dad's shift as an early adopter of holistic management in the 80s. She has furthered the changes on this ranch by incorporating an explicitly decolonial and anti-racist framework into how she presents the ranch's history, carries out its programming, and thinks about its possible futures. Part of this includes experimenting with expanding access to this land to others, such as the Salish Indigenous Language Program, which now brings their students to their land to harvest native camas that still grows there. Alex and I just finished leading a several-day majority BIPOC camp on the ranch, which focuses on providing access to regenerative ranch skills and community to women, non-binary, and queer folks predominantly. I was an attendee both as a participant, and I was also shadowing another participant of this research in Georgia who came to this camp all the way across the country for this very type of education, in the sense that she has not been able to find it for herself due to a variety of reasons we can get into. We're now discussing how various elements of the content went this week. I asked, there were several attendee questions around those fence line pictures that you were showing of your neighbor's land versus your land. Now, to give you some context, fence line pictures are kind of like the quintessential marketing media of regenerative ag. You take a picture that shows one side of the field managed conventionally and the other with some kind of more environmentally minded practices, and it visually calls attention to the stark improvements of biodiversity and soil health you usually see on the latter side. Many variations of this fence line photo exist, such as this moment when a farmer in Tennessee took me to a very specific intersection of two fields, one conventional, one non-till pasture, and then goes and digs up the soil on each side to show the compaction on the left versus the beneficial soil aggregation, how it looks all much like crumbly on the right. Here on the left, we have one of my own fence line photos. I take these photos, and I'm a offender myself from a participant's tractor. A soil erosion in water version of seeing like the water coming off of one farm that's regenerative, one farm that's conventional, and you can see the huge difference in silt coming out of that water. That was from a social media video. And this is an interactive infiltration station at a ranch in Nebraska's Field Day with a truck displaying images of conventional versus no-till soil samples. So these are all very compelling images of the argument to go non-conventional. To return to the kitchen with Alex, I ask her, have you ever shown those fence line photos to those neighbors? She rolls her eyes with a quick chuckle. Yeah, ask my dad that question. Okay, I will ask him. Why do you laugh? I ask. Because one of those fence line pictures was with my with a neighbor my dad already had long-standing social weak link issues with. And there was a newspaper article 10 or 15 years ago that was written about our ranch. Some fence line photos were shown in it. And the neighbor and my dad was quoted in the paper saying how much better our management was, blah, 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 blah. In her dad's recollection to me later, he narrowed on a slightly different yet equally contentious moment of the article. He said, there was a spot over there where there's 3 properties owners coming together in one spot. It's very distinct. One's conventional farming, one's conventional ranching, and then there's me. And he's using regenerative ranching with cattle. And you stand there and you look at the ground and it's all extremely different. So that reporter is looking at that, and then he goes home and writes an article and says that his neighbor's pastures looked like, quote, something from a poor second cousin, which I don't even know what that means. So the neighbor got pissed, and rightly so. He wrote a letter to the editor countering what was talked about. Back in my conversation with Alex, she reflected on this moment. It really did not help anything. It did not help us achieve our holistic context. Why do you say that? I asked. Because I think you should be really careful about fence line pictures and where you show them. I think it can alienate people and make people feel shitty or shamed or judged. And I think they can be really compelling. But as the person monitoring, stewarding this ecosystem, he owns 2,400 acres in the middle of my ranch. If I could get control of that property, I would go from 800 dispersed acres to 3,200 almost continuous acres. It is much more advantageous for me to be that guy's friend than that guy's enemy. Like, who gives a shit what people read in the newspaper? I want to form an alliance with this person. And that is starting to finally maybe feel like I could possibly even approach it because enough of the players have changed. The manager that my dad had a bad relationship with has left. The Gillespies are leasing that property now, and there's some real interest in regenerative ag. They've been showing up at all the field days that Kyle's been putting on, another neighbor of hers who's getting into this world. That's a really good sign. And I'm not even trying to get the lease out from under them. I'd be down to collaborate with them, even if they wanted to not lease part of it or sublease it. That would at least be a little bridge, which would be really cool. I'm left thinking about how the bridges Alex dreams of and is trying so hard to hold space for are more than just physical. Part 2, dialogue and rage. John and I arrived to a canopy of picnic tables in a park in Iowa where we meet around 40 state business leaders. Their programming for that day had focused on learning about natural resources in Iowa, and the morning had included presentations from water, soybean industry, real estate, and wastewater treatment reps. For their afternoon session, the program chose John to present the story of his farm. I'll give you a little bit of his background. Throughout his youth and young adulthood in the 80s, John says he fit the mold of a conventional industrial farmer in Iowa. Growing up, his dad was actually an ag chemical advertising rep, and he remembers being on the front lines of the newest chemicals. Coming out of the farming crisis into the 90s, though, John found himself in a place of frustration and desire to change for the health of his animals. Through the last 20 years, John has transitioned the couple total 100 acres he cares for and deepened his knowledge about carbon sequestration, soil health, waterway nutrient pollution, and animal welfare. In the last several years, John has broadened his goals to include the social and ethical stakes of ag, including taking a critical look at manifest destiny and the violent indigenous dispossession that enabled his family to own this land since the mid-1800s. He's become active in politics and is an active public speaker on racial, mental health, labor, environmental, and labor justice within ag. And he's thinking radically about the concepts of inheritance, property, when it comes time for what to do with this land after he leaves. As he tells his story to these 40 business owners, I then moderate a Q&A between them and John. Attendees are really excited and inspired by his experience, and they ask a lot of follow-up questions. These are just some of the other events, not this particular one. Several questions into their Q&A, a middle-aged white man near the back raises his hand. I bring him the mic. So this has got me pretty worked up. I first interpreted worked up as an inspired way, like many of the other attendees' reactions. This man's facial expression made clear, however, that I'm wrong. He was pissed. Okay, John immediately responds in an accepting, soft tone. The man continues, so I'm from a farm. And you know, I don't want everybody thinking here that this is to blame the farmers, right? They're trying to earn a living. He takes a long pause. It is a very hard life. I've been through a lot, and I chose to get out because it was so hard. Sorry. The man is choked up now to the point of not being able to continue speaking. John breaks the silence. That's okay. I think it's the hardest thing when I see my friends. He pauses again. When we look at the efficiencies, it's changed a lot. And that was one of the toughest things for a lot of us to get for that desire to pass this on. I look at my friends' kids who want to farm and have that opportunity. He continues with a story about efficiencies leading to less folks being able to farm in his community, continually connecting it back to this man's notion of a rural continuity and community. The man responds, and this was not really how the Q&A was going, but he decided to keep having a conversation by comparing farmers to consumers that take the easy way out with their food choices. Farmers are pushed to production. They need to make a living. So what do? They're taking the easy way out. It's the efficiency. We all take the easy way out, right? So he repeats, I guess my point is, don't blame the farmers. Maybe some of them, but don't blame the farmers. The exchange continues for several minutes. John is very sympathetically commiserating with the man's memories of GMOs first coming out, though he traces his own experience with the unattended consequences of herbicide-resistant weeds. He repeats the message that get big or get out isn't working anymore, even though it's still what's taught. He says, all of a sudden, we're farming land we shouldn't farm, and we're using more fertilizer than we've ever dreamed of, because it was literally what the message was to do. And now we're in a situation where we're seeing the soil loss, the biodiversity loss, the water loss. So I completely hear you. It's one of those things. Placing blame is a sign of a failing system. And that's where I'm saying, stand back. No one's really intentionally doing anything wrong, but we've got a system that is literally incentivizing us to do things that are damaging to the environment and damaging of our future. The man seems less upset now. Education. Education is the key, he replies. John affirms him. It's a big part, and then it's seeing what can be done. He continues by talking about some of the financial and mental components of his transitions. Several other audience members have a chance to get in with more questions. About 15 minutes later, the man interjects in a more directly hostile manner when the topic of subsidies comes up. And John navigates the moment courteously, though directly. The Q&A ends on a positive note. On our drive home, we debrief our day. We have long drives in Iowa, so we had plenty of time. John's mind keeps coming back to this man. We discuss how the current ag system caused this man to have to give up his family farm, yet his responses seem to argue for the structures that failed him rather than getting mad at those structures. John also wonders if it was his beginning talk's reference to Columbus colonizing this continent, which John framed in a negative light, that triggered the entire reaction to start. Towards the end of our drive, he again comes back to wondering about this man. I ask him why he's so focused on this man and a little bit worried about him. His response surprises me. It's making him think of his dad. That kind of rage just is something that does remind me of my dad. And he was never very good at certain things like that. And part of it is just, I see a lot of people in it, a lot of it in people I know in the community. And I think that's what keeps us from making any kind of change. Half of it is you're dealing with someone that doesn't even want to entertain another thought. And the other part is you're dealing with behavior that makes other people uncomfortable to even have a dialogue around them. So I think it's twofold. Yesterday, I was Zooming John and I told him I'd be telling you guys this story today. He said I should include the happy ending. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I didn't tell you. And he pulls out his phone and reads a text from the event facilitator that he got a couple weeks after. It read, by the way, the guy who was so upset at our class came back to the next class and told the entire group he needed to open up his mind to new ways of thinking. It was one of the best moments in all of my years running the program. You got through to him. Part 3, small towns and not getting out. After a day of planting chestnut saplings among pasture of sheep, Stephen, his wife Emily, and I sit on their back porch before dinner. Stephen has been filling me in on what I should expect tomorrow at church. In their small Missouri town, Stephen holds a kind of weird role. He's gained attention for converting his grandfather's 600-acre conventional row crop farm to regenerative sheep and silvopasture after discovering his own allergies to herbicides. So for him to continue, change was required. He's also the pastor of the town's church, which happens to be attended by several bigwigs of the Ag Association. At least he's the pastor for now, he jokes/warns, as he suspects he'll eventually get fired for his increasingly vocal opposition to the conservative status quos of both ag and religion. Our porch conversation turns to the town's grain elevator. The Ag Association has been the place where all the farmers around here have taken their corn and soy to the elevator, he says. Emily cuts in. It's closing. Did you know that? What? Are you serious? Yeah. Shit. Stephen, typically soft-spoken and very level-headed, throws his phone hard onto the grass. I'm serious, Emily says. It was in the paper last week. Are you serious? It's closing, like the elevator is closing? He repeats this question several times as if hoping the answer would change. Yes, Emily reiterates. Why, I ask, and why is that making you upset, Stephen? Well, the plan all along has now come to fruition. His tone has changed to explanatory but dejected. Stephen launches into a detailed narrative of how the Ag Association has been communicating for the past decade that their intention was to let this elevator fall into disrepair to the point of closing it rather than keeping it up. This will improve efficiency and profits for the company by consolidating elevators regionally rather than one in each town. It means, though, that smaller and even mid-sized farmers probably won't have the equipment or scale to make switching to those regional locations feasible. He pauses, his voice unsteady. Sorry, I'm a little shaken up by this. I'm frustrated. For that to work, so we couldn't do that as a 600-acre farm. For that to work, you have to have a combine in the field, you have to have a tractor with a grain cart. For the company, it doesn't matter whether you have 300 acres or if those 300 acres are part of 3,000 acres. They would rather just have one person, one deal. He goes on with more details and then he ends with, it's literally killing small row crop operations. But no, it's like they're the ones that are saving small towns. saving small towns, he repeats with a scoff. We sit in a moment in the air of his exasperation. There's an irony of this moment. The entire reason I'm here studying Stephen is because of his passion against conventional row cropping. He doesn't need that elevator. And in some ways, that elevator is a cog in the wheel he wants to disrupt. I ask gently, why does that work you up when you're not in corn and soy? Because, he holds a long pause. So whereas I really don't think corn and soy is the best answer, or maybe the amount of corn and soy should change, I think, another pause, anything that continues to consolidate wealth in the hands of the few, but also continues to force bigger farmers to get bigger and smaller farmers to get out, inherently degrades the structure of a small town. I'm nodding. He continues, the only good that can come for this is I think that now in farming, you kind of got to get big or get weird. So we chose to get weird for a lot of different reasons. Unfortunately, that's not normal. So yeah, it's just going to keep getting fewer and fewer farmers. They're going to get older and older and care less and less. And then he tells a connecting story that I found very interesting. It's like these guys over here I was telling you about, he's pointing. They're doing some really good stuff with cover crops just 20 miles north. They aren't doing it on the land they rent here because they're not here. They don't see the land. They don't walk the land. They don't care for the land. So if there's fewer and fewer eyes per acre, there's fewer and fewer feet walking these acres, and there's less time spent on the land. Why would you care about soil? Why would you care about soil erosion of the land or the water coming off the land? Why would you care about the people in small towns that you don't live in? So yeah, that's why. To conclude, I'm going to jump back to the bigger picture. Through this subset of farmers reckoning with their place in ag, existing in messy honesty within and against a system they are culpable by and also harmed by, I'm investigating what happens when people try to change structures of which they are a constitutive part. I could tell you dozens of stories exactly along the lines of those I just told you. Moments where the reality of being within and against one's own community comes to a head when trying to work for change. These moments exemplify a fundamental tension happening in rural America, in rural environmentalism, and in ag. Are the changes these farmers want antithetical or counter to rural America, as many of their critics imply, or are the changes the very thing rural America has to have to thrive? My point of telling these stories is that in this context, this tension isn't abstract. It is actual tension. It is in the actual dialogue happening in kitchens, workshops, garden clubs, town halls, churches, and field days of these communities. There's something I find fantastically refreshing about how these moments refuse simplification or polite retreat back to one's echo chamber. And that's because these folks have made a decision to stay within the context they are fighting to change while holding deep attachments and understandings of. I'm going to end on a bit of a different note. So I've painted a picture of these reckoning farmers, as I call them, as marginal oddballs floating in an overwhelming sea of monoculture. That's also the image I've read in many ethnographies of rural America. You're driving along a highway in this mirage of corn that blurs together to feel all-encompassing. The people in rural, Midwestern, and Southern spaces tend to get similarly homogenized. I want to leave you with the counter today, though, that I don't experience driving down these roads in this way anymore. Instead, I find myself looking out for polywire fencing. I notice where fields have cover crops peeking out. My eyes trace patterns of erosions and their intentional farmer placement of prairie strips to try to attest to them. I notice a crop that isn't corn or soy or cotton or peanuts. I notice a crop that is corn or soy, but has a particularly pervasive weed problem that actually brings me joy because I know that means the farmer's trying something different, even though I also know their neighbors are totally judging. I see yard signs for a particular event, organization, or political candidate next to pastures I can tell have been chomped on by a cow followed by a sheep. When you take time to notice, to read it, I don't think this is a landscape that blurs together. I think it differentiates out into touches of ecological and social difference that are, at least to these farmers, invitations for dialogue. Thank you, and I will now open up for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Sydney. I have a quick question while folks gather some thoughts, and that was fantastic. And actually, after a year of just hearing rural people reduced to like polling statistics of like 0 or 1, Republican, Democrat, chicken or fish, it's like really, really refreshing just to actually hear people in their own voice and expressing the diversity in rural communities, but also within rural people. The folks you're working with are doing a lot, and so I'm like kind of feel silly about this question, saying what's next, but in the background of a lot of your talk is like, of course, these changes and these conventional systems didn't just happen on farms or primarily happen within farms. They were created by a broader infrastructure of banks, of lending, of university research, of Cargills, and so forth. And then similarly, I'm thinking of like the early cow pictures and so forth and being like, well, of course, that's part of an infrastructure too beyond the farm. And so my question is just simply how or if people are also thinking about a regenerative, weird, or oddball infrastructure of processing, marketing, and so forth. Like, how are they thinking about the work that needs to be done beyond the farm to enable these farms to continue to maintain their networks?
So there is not consensus within the folks I work with about that. Some of them are like, the world's going to hell. What I can do is change the ecosystem on my farm, maybe my neighbors. Like, I need to think about my scale of change in that way. I do not want to talk about policy or politics. Obviously, all of this is very political, though. The moment where it always becomes much more like, wait, we need to be thinking about all of these infrastructures and systems is meat processing, which some of these folks are engaged with in a really interesting way. A couple of them have their own processing facilities that they have actually built on their farm because they are very invested in this idea that we need regional and farmer owned or farmer labor cooperatively owned slaughterhouses. And those slaughterhouses also look quite differently in terms of the animal ethics and the welfare than your traditional slaughterhouse. That is also the kind of structural conversation. I would say more than half of the people I'm working with are like, there are so much other things we need to change. They're talking about subsidy structures. They're talking about land access is like a big one where you can't just change soil health and expect anything else about who is able to access land to really change. The labor conversation is also where it kind of erupts into this far larger topic because the majority of the labor of these facilities in Iowa, in Georgia, all across the US, a high percentage is undocumented labor. And so that is where the moment for a lot of them has been, I actually need to be talking about labor equity too. Like, it doesn't matter if I can grow these regenerative sheep, I don't have anywhere actually to bring them if my town doesn't have labor, and my town needs to do some things to make that labor actually be able to have good lives here is kind of the next step. And some are not talking about that, and some are in for, I would say, a potentially true reckoning this coming couple of years because of kind of the conversation of, can we just solve this in the soil or on particular farms, or do we need to have widespread changes? Some of the folks, we can get into more politics if folks want, but some of the folks are being tapped to be relatively high up in the USDA in the next administration. And that has things I'm excited about and things that worry me, and things they're excited about and things they're really worried about. But yes, I would say at least half of them or more of these folks are not content with this being an on-farm shift. And they are seeing that especially in like the need to create more markets for what farmers can sell and actually like give them a premium for this ecological service that right now they're basically doing because they feel it's the right thing and because the input costs go lower with a lot of this. So they can make enough money via that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lecture. That was so interesting and definitely leaves me with a lot of thoughts. So I'll try and make this as concise as possible. But I think something I've been thinking about recently in the wake of the hurricanes this fall and the election results is what seems to be a disconnect from communities most impacted by climate change and support for climate policy. And I say this with like the naivete of being from a liberal city, but how are these communities and the people you've been working with talking about climate change, and are these transitions to regenerative agriculture, what's the like main motivation by it? Is it a cost thing? Is it actually feeling the differences in the soil, or are they what do the conversations about climate change look like?
Yeah, great question. So some of them use the word climate change. Some of them explicitly do not use the word climate change. Some of them, it depends which room they walk into. And these folks are master code switchers. And they are exactly the people that are within multiple communities and know when you can or can't use that. But a vast majority of the folks I'm working with say climate change is real. This is what we're doing. Now, how they present that in various spaces changes. And the cool thing about this, and there's some issues with this like common ground narrative that has been increasingly prevalent in regenerative ag, saying regenerative ag is a common ground, whether or not you believe in climate change or not, whether you're in this party or not, we can all come together to say, we want better soil for our community. We want happier animals. We want better food. There is an element of like, it doesn't exactly matter which reason people are doing this for. It does once you get into the structural stuff. So like the soil health conversation is pretty widely agreed upon, and there's a lot of perspectives in that world. They are not all the same politically, they are not all the same in terms of climate change, but they can come to that consensus. In terms of when you have to start code switching or talking about different things or like different reasons why people get into it, it varies so much. It varies from, I started feeling guilt about inheriting this land, to I hated seeing my cows shivering and freezing when giving birth in January and decided, why in the world am I doing this? I'm going to start calving in April. Animal, like relationship with animal is a big starter for most of them. I would say like farmers care about their animals deeply. And even if they are a farmer that is doing animal ag in a way that us in this space might say it's not ethical or something, or it's too big, they care about the animals still. And so the desire to have a better life for their animals is a huge starting point for a lot of them. Also, like, there's different starting points in families. So one person might be interested because they've gotten into this sustainable local food conversation. Their dad just started getting interesting because he can hunt more on the land because there's more wildlife now. And the fact that they now have a certain kind of bird that they didn't have is like what started him going, okay, yes, let's do this. The concept of like being able to provide another job for someone in town, that's a reason to do this. So the reasons I have not been able to come to, to get into this place, you get interested in this, and then this, and then this. It varies tremendously.
Thank you for just a splendid and wonderful talk. It's great to have you back. Early on, you talked about this farmer in Washington State, my home state, and about not wanting to make an enemy of your neighbor. And it reminds me of a recent thesis in my department of biology, which was looking at social contagion around the planting of pollinator gardens. And so this is the idea of spread. So I guess I have two questions. One is, are you seeing significant spread? If you were to show a graph in Iowa of regenerative farming over the last 20 years, would you be able to describe what that might look like? And And I forgot my second question. I'll come to it after you answer this one.
We'll start with that one. So I was telling you earlier, I was really weird because I'm seeing it as this like place where a ton of interesting things are happening in regenerative ag, and the most integrated, well-networked community of folks doing this is Iowa, is certain organizations in Iowa that have been a part of this. But there's still massive conventional ag and monocropping is the norm. One thing that's been interesting is a couple of these folks got on the state FSA level of the USDA in this last administration. So they got a couple leaders like within their state ag that are these kind of folks. And that has been, I think, an interesting dynamic the past couple of years. They're about to get booted out. So we'll see what happens with that. In terms of the social aspects, so a lot of folks say the reason people stay conventional is peer pressure, that their neighbors are all doing the same thing and their families all doing the same thing. Their dad says how to do it, and peer pressure means they stay the same. There is an interesting peer pressure happening elsewhere. So like another story I didn't tell was another guy that is part of this network, one of my participants, really doesn't like when people say like people do it because of peer pressure. He says, I feel peer pressure from a very different community than was my peer pressure community 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, the peer pressure, the social effects that make people decide to try something or not, it was the people around him. Now his peers are not in his community because he's the only oddball, but his peers truly are folks around Iowa that are part of this network and folks all across the country. And he feels peer pressure when he sees one of their TED Talks talking about a new technique they're doing for cover crops. And he's like, oh my God, I got to try this. I'm not up to date. Like the exact worries that people are saying and why they're staying conventional, he feels for regenerative. So neighbor-wise, there's not really a social spread. Like most of these people still have most neighbors that are not interested or doing this. A broader network, yes, there is social spread. And there's also many stories of folks noticing that their neighbors are doing cover crops after a particularly terrible year of storms. They don't tell them, hey, I noticed you were doing cover crops, and then I read about this is why maybe my soil erosion was so much worse than yours on the other side of the field, so now I'm trying it. But he knows he is the person that neighbor's looking towards, but the neighbor won't tell him, you're why I did this.
So maybe my follow-up is my understanding of Iowa is southern Iowa is very rolling hills and has a different topography. And that's where
Very
a lot
much.
of the experimental farming is, as I understand it, is taking
That's where
place.
John is.
And in the northern part of Iowa, it's really flat and it's corn and soy. Are you seeing creep of regenerative into northern Iowa?
Regenerative is all over Iowa. There is not more in the South. I would say the Southern farmers explain their ability to try different things with exactly what you just said, that they're a little more experimental. I know people experimenting in northern North Dakota, like the argument that like that works here, but it won't work there, or it won't work in my context, always kind of seems to disintegrate because there's examples of people doing this in every single ecosystem in the US. But that is the vibe a little bit, that some northern Iowa will say, I'm not a southern Iowa guy. I can't be trying that.
Thank you for such a great talk. I have two questions. One is from the chat, and then I have my own, but I'll read the one from the chat first. It's from Professor Kathy Stanton. She says, I'm struck by the story of the farmer who discovered he was allergic to some of the chemicals he was using, and also the video you showed for my class yesterday with the farmer talking about his kids' birth defects probably being linked with ag chemicals. Have you seen any emerging or potential links with public health discourse or projects that seem to offer openings for change? And then she also says, also realize this may get tangled up in weird public health politics at the federal level in the coming years.
Yeah. So the health aspect is really interesting, and the farmers' own bodily health is something they're not really incentivized or normalized to talk about. Like most of their bodies are experiencing the labor of this just as farm workers do really fast. So like they all have a lot of health issues, and many of them are attributing it to many of the chemicals that they have been exposed to for years. The story she's referencing is one of, in Kathy's food systems class yesterday, one of the videos we assigned them to watch was from one of the farmers I work with. And part of his transition was also a reckoning with both of his kids having various levels of health issues and disabilities when they were born. And he loves his kids dearly. I've gotten to know his kids. They're amazing. They all do wonder, was this caused by this? And there's a level of personal culpability and deep trauma that is a part of any of those stories. The health organization, like, so this actual farmer is trying to organize a talk at his local hospital about this exact topic. And this gets people mad, like talking about if farmers are causing their communities diseases, especially when you talk about child impacts, especially when you talk about cancer. Those are the two things people get really mad. It's really hard for people to come to that they might be the person that is applying a chemical that is hurting their neighbor, themselves, their mom, their kid. We're going to see if that hospital talk happens. If it does, it will be so interesting. Those like health, the events that are health focused are ones that have gotten really contentious. And there's been like a lot more drama than just this one guy that had his kind of upset moment. That's where farmers get really mad at each other. There's also a rancher versus farmer disagreement about who's causing the most chemical issues. For various reasons. Farmers generally say like it's the rancher guys, and ranchers generally say it's the farmer guys, and it becomes this head-to-head debate rather than a broader like we are all part of this system and this is hurting all of us. So yeah, if that answers the question, the health thing gets really testy really fast, especially because it's so deeply personal. The last thing I'll say is John is actually mentioned nutrient pollution. John is one of the few that has actually gotten really outspoken that we don't only need to talk about the chemical impacts for our communities. That's really reductive of the chemical issue because he lives in Iowa. Iowa is the greatest polluter of the Gulf of Mexico. More chemicals than any other state, especially because of the hog industry, they find these stats are coming into the Gulf of Mexico. So he took a trip this summer down the entire Mississippi and he took water samples, and the water samples were kind of just to take water samples. It's not really hard science, but it's trying to tell a narrative of trying to trace his own path of nutrients that he applied at one time, no longer applies, but is right next to and still has from his neighbors to the Gulf, and talking to people in the Gulf that are affected. So the health impacts thing also is like, are we talking about health impacts on the land of the food or downstream?
Thank you. And then my other question was, like, based on your experience working with and engaging with farmers that are going through this reckoning of like wanting to create change in a system that they like already exist in, like what would be your advice to other people going through similar things? Because I'm thinking about like students particularly, and how like that's something that I think a lot of us experience in our own like focuses, is like how do we create change in a system that we like are actively a part of? Like what are your thoughts on that?
That's my most central deep question. How do people change, especially in complicated situations? I mean, I think what I've learned from these folks the most is like, they are the most community embedded people I have ever met. They are so ingrained in their community, and part of it's the multi-generational thing. Like none of these stories aren't connected to tons of families in the community. So I think one thing I've learned from them is like stay really grounded in where you are and try to understand people and also use the resources you have. So I can't tell you the resources that you as an individual student have, but they're looking kind of internally and going, okay, I have certain land, I have certain privilege in my community because everybody knows my last name, and I can go do a certain thing that someone else couldn't because of who I am. John, one of my favorite stories of John is during a Trump parade in his town a couple years ago, he, a former Republican, actually, he ran for Republican office several years ago. He, 6'3", well-known, straight white guy in town. No one's gonna mess with him. He drove his bike with a bunch of Harley bicycle friends with a Biden flag through the Trump parade. He makes noise in a way that he can because of who he is. And he's very clear that like, I can do this because of all the things I said about his identity. I'm not expecting other people to do it, but he's in a really interesting way, like coming to an understanding of the power he has. And different people are doing that in different ways on each of these farms in terms of like who they are in the community, what power they have, what power they don't have. Many of these folks live in areas that the vast majority of folks are on free and reduced lunch. They are farmers and they are food insecure. Like there's so many levels. So these aren't like wildly privileged folks in some senses, and they are in other senses because of who they are, their inheritance, their land access, their race, their gender, all of these things. So using that and thinking really critically about who they are in their community would be how they would tell you to like think about that.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we have to end there, but Sydney will stay along after if anyone has any questions. And one thing I also wanted to throw out is that, you know, a lot of the talks we've been given are part to give people a sense of what they can do with a degree in environmental studies and so forth. And one thing I've always been so impressed with Sydney is, yes, doing a PhD in anthropology, but oftentimes I think when we think a PhD in the social sciences or the humanities, it's like you can be a professor and that's it. But listening to this, and I'm sure she'd be happy to talk with you more, I think she's really set herself up to be able to do a whole lot of things, from rural development to policy to research and a professor. So I thought this was a wonderful talk, and thank you so much, Sydney.
Thank you all.